Welcome back to Real Talk, guys, here with Jeff Green. And in part two, we'll be discussing Jeff's career as a game journalist, a game dev, and of course, all the things that he did over at EA, which is quite numerous, obviously. And we'll get to that towards the end of this. So you are fresh out of college, or maybe even in college. What were some of the jobs that you worked prior to joining up with CGW?
Okay.
Or I guess the Ziff Davis media family is probably the better
Ziff
way to put
Davis,
that.
that's right. I did work all the way through college, which I'm glad I did, and it was mostly the kind of jobs that you would expect. I flipped burgers. I worked at a place in Berkeley called The Good Earth, which was like a health food restaurant. Not that I was a health food guy, like far from it, but there was a job available. So I worked as a prep cook. I'm telling this story because it's the only story I have about being a prep cook, which is one of the jobs I had was I had to make the salad dressing every day, and we would make them in these gigantic metal bins because it was a popular restaurant, and then I would have to pour the bins into multi-gallon buckets. Anyway, so I made all this poppy seed dressing one day, and was out doing some other stuff, and my boss came up and said, "I need to talk to you." And he drags me back into the kitchen and opens up the freezer, and he says, "I want you to look at the poppy seed dressing and tell me what you think's wrong with it." And I open up the thing, and I take a bite, and it tastes good to me, and I'm just like baffled. I just look at him like, I don't know. And he says, "Well, you forgot the poppy seeds." So that was pretty much the end of my career, my cooking career. And so I didn't pursue food service after that. My first real job out of college, once I had my BA, which was in English literature, very practical BA to get. I knew I wanted to be going back to what we talked about in the first part, in my head I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't feel like I was good enough. I didn't actually believe in myself. So I wanted to do the next best thing, which was be an editor. I wanted to be around people who wrote. And so I applied. So I wanted to get a job at like a publishing place. I didn't care what. I had no direction in that way. Like I didn't want to be at a certain publication at that point. I just wanted a job. And I was just on the UC Berkeley job boards, and I found a job as a proofreader at a place called Cybex Computer Books. I think they actually still exist. They're in Alameda. They made, they probably don't make books anymore. It's probably all, online courses or whatever. But at the time, these were thick, super thick paperback books, like hundreds and hundreds of pages that would be like, Introduction to Lotus 123 or whatever, Mastering Word Perfect. It was all that kind of crap. And I was a proofreader, so my job was to sit there with the four other proofreaders who were all college-age people with English degrees. And we just sat at these desks for 8 hours. And in those days, this is pre-digital, the text would come out on these long sheets, these long galleys. And we would cut them with X-Acto knives and put them on pasteboards. This is actually the literal origin of cut and paste. We had X-Acto knives, and we were cutting and then pasting down on the boards the text, and then we would proofread it. And I was reading what I was reading. I did not understand because I did not have a tech background. I was reading it like for grammar, for spelling, but like. All the language at the time meant nothing to me. I was even reading code. Like sometimes in these books, they would have like a sample programs, and I would have to sit there and go line by line through the programs and just make sure that all the letters were right, even though I had no idea what I was reading. But what happened as a result of that, though, was that I got curious because I had no techie background, but I was in the Bay Area, and it was the early 80s, and if you were doing journalism, or this wasn't journalism, if you were an editor, all the jobs were in tech. And as a result of hanging around Cybex for a while, a position came open at that company after I was a proofreader for a technical editor, which meant actually going through the book. Instead of as a proofreader, I was going through as someone who was actually using the book. So I would sit there with the text, and I would sit there with whatever it was, DBase or WordPerfect or whatever software at the time, and I would just follow it along. And as a result of doing that job, I actually learned all this stuff about computers and about programs, not about coding, but about just actually getting comfortable with using software at that time, which was really not at all like what it is now. There were no GUIs.
Right.
You know, there was the original Macintosh, which I owned, but other than that, you know, it was all DOS. And so that's where I sort of got familiar with computers and learned that I actually liked futzing around with them. And from there, it was a very short leap into that's around the time I started playing Zork and all those things.
How long would you how long would you say you worked at that job? Was that a year or 2 years? How long, or months?
I worked. It was actually a few years. If there's one common thread in my whole career, is I always stay at every job too long. There's always a point at which I go, this did not happen with Computer Gaming World. That's the one exception. But basically with every other job, there's always a point where I go like, man, I probably should have quit like 2 years ago when I was still happy. For some reason, I'm just one of those dudes who like lingers. Sure. And then realizes it, like a light bulb goes over my head, like, wow, I don't actually have to be miserable the rest of my life. I can just get a new job. So I stayed at Cybex like all the way until 91. So almost 5 years, which just I can't believe it. That just sounds awful. But I was getting promoted. You know, I was working my way up the chain of Cybex computer books, for what that's worth.
Sure.
But my very next job from that was with Ziff Davis. So I started with Ziff Davis in 1991. That was my second job.
And what was that transition like? Was that you actively looking for a new job and you stumbled upon Ziff, or?
What it was that Ziff Davis, at the time, they were all a magazine company at that time. It was PC Magazine, CGW, of course. They had all the tech magazines, and they were giants back in that day. They were still family owned. The Ziff family owned them, and they were because everything was still print based. Everything they wanted to get into what was the then burgeoning computer book marketplace, and because everything else was happening on the West Coast, they decided to open up their own computer book company, Ziff Davis Press, in the West Coast. And what they did was they came in and they basically headhunted all the existing computer book places like Cybex, and they plucked a whole bunch of us out. So I left with a bunch of people from Cybex to go to Ziff Davis. I was lured away by a bigger paycheck and the promise of better working conditions, etc. So my initial job with Ziff Davis was doing the same thing again. I was doing computer books. They're basically like textbooks, if you will.
Right.
And I did that for 2 years. Yeah.
How? I mean, what was it like? Anything similar to the Ziff Davis that I think the majority of my generation knows? I guess knew maybe is a better word.
Tell me what that means. I'll tell you.
Is it like how different was, I guess, the company back then from what I know it as is kind of in the one-up days? I mean, it's probably night and day, right?
To some extent, it was like until they sold, which was, I'm gonna say mid-90s. It was a great place to work. They treated people really well. It was always known for, even when the upper management was not the greatest, Ziff Davis did have a reputation for hiring like really good, talented people, and you certainly could see that, as we get to talking about one-up, like down the line, like that was all a legacy of just like really great, hiring practices, and it would just be sort of a domino effect of like they'd hire one cool person and then they'd hire the next cool person. And really all of my Ziff Davis experiences, it comprised three places. First was Ziff Davis Press, the book place, from 91 to 93. From there I went to Mac Week magazine, and we could talk about that. But Mac Week and then CGW, the common thread of all those is they were always great people to work with. So that was one thing about Ziff Davis that was very true. But another thing about Ziff Davis that's also true, and this even is partially in the Ziff days too, was that there were a lot of, well, I was going to say morons. And then I caught myself, but what the hell. There were a lot of morons in the senior management. And, God knows, I don't know, looking back, could I have done better if I was them at the time? I like to think I could, but there's just like so many bad decisions that were made all the time that were just like laughable. And in some ways working for Ziff Davis, to me, in retrospect, felt like being like on MASH or something, or being in jail or something. Like all ex-Ziff people were like all ex-cons. It's like something we had to live through. Like we had we survived it. We had a great time. We loved each other. But like dealing with Ziff as a corporation was just an exercise in, extreme patience. And, in the Ziff Davis Press, I'll give you the classic story. The publisher at the time, we were always trying to come up with new schemes to sell computer books. Okay, it was like it's not the most exciting product. And so the publisher at the time, he went on a trip to Germany, and he came back from Germany, and we called us all into a meeting. Those of us, I was like a developmental editor, so which is fairly high up. So he brought in the senior staff, and he's like, guys, I was over in Germany, and I discovered a new thing they're doing over there. It's really popular, and I know it's going to catch on here, and no one else is doing it, and we'll be the first to do it. We're going to put a book in a can. And I'm not making it up. It was a can. Actually, I can give you a prop. It was a lot bigger than this, but it was like this shape, like the shape of a Tootsie Roll, a tube. It was like a tube-shaped thing, but bigger. And in Germany, I guess at some point that was a thing that would roll up a book and stick it in a can with a lid on it. And I think they would put other like goodies or whatever incentives to buy it in there. I don't know what. And so we decided we were going to do that. And his genius brainstorm was, we're going to call this, because it was going to be a series. This was going to be a series called Can Do. I get it, like a can do, word perfect.
This was mid '80s. What was the time?
This was '90s. This was early '90s.
Okay, so that even makes it a little bit worse.
Yeah, it's even worse. It's really not that long ago.
Yeah.
So the first one of these was going to be called Can Do DOS. You can do it with the book in a can from Cybex. So we worked on this fucking thing, and all of us who were editors, all of us there were just like, this is like the most awful thing ever. We knew it was a joke. Like, we weren't kidding ourselves. Not one person was going like, yeah, a book in a can. Like, we were all just like, what the fuck are they thinking? Like, there's no way one person is going to buy this. So, but we did it anyway because it was our job,
Sure.
And unlike my game industry jobs, like I had a lot of friends at these jobs, but I did not like the work. I was not a happy person. Like these were jobs that like most people have in life, which is I had to endure it until I could leave at the end of the day.
Sure.
Like reading computer book stuff was not fun for me. So anyway, so we worked on Can Do DOS. We made the book. We manufactured all the cans, and then we went to Comdex, which at the time was, the big convention in Vegas. It was like the big tech convention, so kind of like CES now or whatever. And we had a booth where we were debuting Can Do DOS. And people started coming up to us, and they would read the title, and they would go, Can Do Do's? What is Can Do Do's?
Oh, man.
And not one person... It hadn't crossed one person's mind that Can Do DOS also looked like Can Do Do's.
Definitely not marketing gurus.
Yeah, and that was the end of the Can Do series.
Oh, man.
By Ziff Davis Press. But that was typical of the kind of crap we were doing and why I hated that job so much.
Oh man, what were some of the rookie mistakes that you yourself were a part of back then, if you can even remember any of those?
Well, I think rookie mistakes. That's a great question. I was at one point. I don't know if you're familiar with John Dvorak, but I was his book editor. He's still around. He was like in the first wave of tech journalists, and he made quite a name for himself. I think one of the mistakes I made as an editor early on was I was probably a little too cocky with the writers. Like I could have done better. I learned later that writers can be a sensitive sort with their text, and I was a little more mercenary because I was like an English major from Berkeley, and these are just dudes writing about computers. They don't know anything. So I think I worked too hard to try to change their prose into my prose. Uh, Also because I was a frustrated writer, So I was like trying to put my stamp on things when really the best editors are the ones who are invisible, and just sort of make the writer shine on their own, you know. So that's probably a rookie mistake. And then another rookie mistake I made was I didn't learn how to shut up with management. I was always the guy, I was always fucking complaining and, getting on my high horse about things. And I've done that throughout my career. I'm always biting the hand that feeds. But back then I didn't learn. I had to learn later where the boundary was, like where not to push it, where it's actually better if you just go shut up and go back to your desk and do your job.
It's interesting to me that did you ever have like repercussions of that, or is it just more?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Anything dire? At least that you feel careful of.
Yep. Oh, sure. At Ziff Davis Press, that book company, I wasn't fired, but I was laid off, and it was totally a political layoff. I mean, they had a small group of layoffs. Every one of us who got laid off, we were all the troublemakers. We were all the people who were just complaining about shit, who were saying like can do DOS was a stupid idea. Like one day we came in and we were gone, and it was so obvious who they picked. It was so obvious that they got rid of us. Sure. And we all went out drinking at 11 that morning, and so I lost my job basically from just being a malcontent. And it's not doing the corporate party line thing.
Right. Well, I guess you learned your lesson now, or maybe you didn't, because
I kind of didn't. Yeah. I don't think I learned my lesson. Maybe I'm learning my lesson now.
Okay.
In my early 50s, I've decided I'm not going to work at another big company anymore. I think I've learned over time it's not the best fit for me.
Well, there you go.
I've had great experiences all along. I don't regret not one single job I've had. They've all made me the person that I am today. But there's certain environments it's taken me decades to learn that I'm better at than other environments. And environments that have like a lot of middle managers and stuff like that, I'm not good at that. I'm not. I don't behave well.
Well, you said before you even get to CGW that prior to that it was Macworld magazine. Is that accurate?
Mac Week. Yeah.
Mac Week.
It was a weekly. We were actually competitors with Macworld. So what happened was I was laid off by Ziff Davis, but Mac Week was a Ziff Davis publication. So I was actually never off the Ziff Davis payroll. What happened was the boss threw me out because she hated my guts. In fact, one thing that sucks about that, to this day, in fact, was I never got along with the boss at Ziff Davis Press. We were enemies from the start. And right around the time that I was about to get laid off is when I got married. And at the time, I was all my friends were people who worked at that company, and I was like, oh my God, like, do I have to invite her? Like, please tell me I don't have to invite Cindy. But everybody else was coming. So I felt like I had to. So I did. So my boss, who I couldn't stand, actually came to my wedding. If you look at my wedding picture, she's there, like the worst boss I ever had, and at my wedding. And then like right after my wedding, she fired me or
Oh
she laid me
man.
off. So I was like, you bitch. Like she had to know. She had to know at my wedding that she was going to lay me off, and she chose to come anyway.
Man.
So, so to this day, I can look at the wedding pictures and still go. "Grr."
Yeah.
Um, but so anyway, so she laid me off. But Ziff Davis, because it was a layoff, I wasn't actually fired, even though she was firing me. It was a layoff. But because of that, Ziff Davis had job openings, and they were kind of obliged to help those of us who were laid off out. And so they contacted me and they said, "Hey Jeff, there's a position at MacWeek magazine. Do you want it? Would you like to interview for that?" And that was a really big turning point in my life, because that was now a magazine. It was not books. It was not these horrible, awful books that would take months and months and months of time to make about stuff I was not interested in at all. Now it was a weekly magazine, so the pace was super fast, way faster than Computer Gaming World was later, which was a monthly. So I was on a weekly Macintosh magazine. It was a business mag, so it was still pretty dry for me. It wasn't my kind of thing, but it turned me on to the magazine business and the magazine world, and I discovered by accident that I really liked that pace and I liked that environment. Suddenly I was in journalism, kind of by accident. I was an editor, but I had, I was assigned certain beats that I had to cover. So 90% of that time or more, I was still editing other people's articles. I did not feel particularly confident yet in my life as a writer. I did write a couple reviews of things, but for the most part, I was still just an editor. But it did get me into the magazine world. It set me up for what became the Computer Gaming World job. And I mean, by this time, we're now talking about 93. I was also now playing games like pretty heavily.
Hmm.
And because I was at a Mac magazine, and of course we all had Macs in the office, we didn't have PCs, but we were playing Bungie's Marathon really hardcore at that time. And that was one of the first multiplayer games ever, along with Doom, or multiplayer shooters. So we had marathon servers going on like after work at Mac Week. That's my fondest memory of Mac Week was playing games after hours.
Was there any articles or features or anything that you wrote for Mac Week that you kind of remember fondly to this day?
There's one that I remember editing, that I remember, two that I remember fondly, basically because I was screwing around and I got away with it. Well, actually, I didn't get away with it. I got in trouble both times, but both things made it into print, which made me happy. Because it was a really staid magazine. This was at a time, this is pre-iPod or whatever. All Apple really had were the Macs and the Newton briefly, which I owned a Newton. But they had a real chip on their shoulder back in those days about like not getting taken seriously, like Microsoft and IBM and the other companies. Like they were like the kiddie machine, and they hated it. And on our magazine, they were like, the Mac is a business machine, And so we couldn't ever write about anything fun. We couldn't ever really have any fun in the magazine because fun was not business-like, which was just completely contrary to my whole personality. So I was always frustrated. So anyway, one of the writers was a friend of mine, and he was assigned to do a review of early software that was, it was early photo capture software. So he had to, he used the software to take a photo of himself and then manipulate it. And so we decided as a joke just to put him in a Viking helmet for the photo. So that's all we did. We just took a photo of the writer wearing a Viking helmet, and it got into the magazine, and we wrote a caption that was sort of, I can't remember it, but it was vaguely pirate-esque. It was vaguely like "Yar." And so I was so happy that we got this little tiny like thing of humor in the magazine. And sure enough, I got called into the editor-in-chief's office. And in those days, like the editor-in-chief to me was like, the grand poobah the big hallway, the big office at the end of the corner. Like I was afraid of the guy, so
Right.
getting called into his office was like a big deal, and I was like, ugh. And he said like, this is just not acceptable. And I remember that I pushed back. I was like, oh, who cares? Like really, it's funny. Like no one's going to see this and think our magazine is not professional. They may actually laugh, and is that a bad thing? Um, and The only other thing I got in a magazine like that, and it's probably not even going to be funny to anyone, but it still remains funny to me and the editor who I did it with, was we were super punch drunk one night late. It was like the night before the magazine had to go to bed. It was weekly, so we were always on, and we were frantically editing this article on Fox Pro, and the writer, which was a database program, and the writer was so enthusiastic about it. It was like he was reviewing, you know, the Lord of the Rings movies or something. He was so into it, and it was cracking us up. His tone was so over enthusiastic for a database program that we started interjecting comments in it. And At one point, he said something that the program did great, and I just typed in, "Bravo, Fox Pro," with like 3 exclamation points. And we made sure to excise all that stuff before it went to print, except we forgot that line.
Oh
So that got
no.
printed. And again, I got hauled into an office because of Bravo, Fox Pro. But it's funny because when I look back on I was there for 3 years. Those are the only 2 things I remember. I don't remember the day in and day out. I remember the 2 things where I fucked off and got away with it.
What was the transition from Mac Week to CGW? Was that again another instance of getting fired, laid off, or was it something
No,
that you saw that you hoped for and tried to get?
yeah, that was that was the real turning point of my life. That it was during the time I was at Mac Week, and that was when I was really getting into gaming full on, like not just the Mac stuff, but everything. And that's when I started reading the gaming magazines on my own for fun. And I actually remember a day where I was sitting at my desk at Mac Week, being utterly bored because I hated it. I hated the work. I was not interested. I had the modem and router beat. I've told this story before, but that was like what I had to cover, modems. So like the stories would come in on modems, and I would have to. There would be like reviews of modems, and I was like, what can you say? You know, all the green lights are going on when they're supposed to. And the time when I knew it was over for me was I had to attend a modem conference in San Jose. So I had to drive my car down to San Jose. It was like an hour and a half drive with all of these other tech journalists, and we were sitting at this giant round table to have, I don't know why, I don't remember what the context was, and I guess there were modem vendors too, and we were having this big round table talk about modems. And I remember like we had to go around the table. Everybody had to go around the table and say who they were, where they were from, and say like what they wanted out of the convention or out of the talk. And I was so out of place. Like I didn't give a shit about
Sure.
modems. I didn't know anything about them. I didn't care. And I remember like being utterly like in a complete flop sweat. Like what am I going to say when it's my turn? I was just paying attention to what everybody else was saying to try to glom on. Well, if I cobble together a little bit of what that guy said and what that guy said, it can be plausible what I said. Well, I'm most interested in discussing the future of baud rates or whatever it would be, you know. But I was so miserable. I was so miserable, and we went out. At one point there was a coffee break at like 11 a.m. and this was like a 9 to 5 ordeal. And I went out at not at 11 a.m. And no one else from our magazine was there. So at 11 a.m. I went out during the coffee break, and I went in my car and I sat in my car and I turned on the music. And I was just like, man, I don't know. I just don't know if I can go back in there. And I didn't. I just drove away. I drove home and didn't go back. And I never got called on it. But that was the point at which I was like, I gotta quit. And I was so sorry. This is a roundabout way of answering your question. I was at my desk at Mac Week being miserable, and I was reading Electronic Gaming Monthly, and I was reading Computer Gaming World, and I was reading Next Generation, the first iteration of that, and it was driving me nuts because I was reading them and I was like, why do these guys get these jobs? It's not fair that I have to edit these fucking modem articles and these guys are getting to edit game reviews. It's not fair. And then it was just like, well, and then I would read the stuff and I was like, and I can, like, this isn't any better than anything I could do. Like, I could totally do this. And so Computer Gaming World was in the Ziff Davis family. It was part of it was in the family of magazines. I was at MacWeek, and Computer Gaming World was another. And what happened, it was just one of those like fortuitous, like the clouds aligned, was that Ziff Davis, Computer Gaming World originally was independent and they were in Orange County, but after Ziff Davis bought them, they made them move up to San Francisco. So suddenly, one of the gaming magazines that I was reading was now about to be in the same building as where we were, and I was like, "This is it, man! Like, it's now or never." Like, I knew that like inter-transfer things from one magazine to another was actually something that Ziff Davis did do, and so I wrote like a hardcore letter to the editor-in-chief at the time, Johnny Wilson. Basically, like, I was practically like begging. Mm-hmm. You know, I was just like, I have to work for you. Please hire me. Like, I'll do anything. I'll lick the floors with my tongue, whatever you want. Please get me the fuck off the modem beat at MacWeek. And I tried to write it funny, and I put gaming stuff in there to show that I had some cred in that area, and it worked. He was like, whatever, my timing was right or whatever. There was an editor who was leaving. And he was like, and he hired me, like not right then in the first response, but real soon after. Uh-huh. Like, I just landed the job, and that was really all she wrote. Like, that now accounts for the rest of my career. And believe me, the very first day I went to Computer Gaming World, like, I was home. Like, that was where I was like, where have you been all my life? Like, sure. Why was I not in not maybe this job, but a job like this? Like, I'm now with my people. Like, I found my tribe. Suddenly, everybody I worked with was a gamer, and they were slackers, and they hated authority, and all the things that I felt made me a misfit in my first jobs was now par for the course. And like, they pranked me like full on that first day. Like, they put me through all this bullshit. Like, so they completely hazed me hardcore, like, and it was great. Like, they totally got me.
What was the prank that they pulled? I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to hear.
Here's how they hazed me. When I was still at MacWeek, I was told that these Computer Gaming World guys who had just moved up to San Francisco were a bunch of irresponsible fuck-ups, and that every month they barely got the magazine out the door. And the printer, the company that was actually the printer, hated the guys at Computer Gaming World because they were such slackers and they were so irresponsible. And I was told, like, Jeff, you do not want to go into that environment. It's completely unprofessional. And I was like, I don't know, man. That sounds like perfect for me. But I was warned that they were so unprofessional that they would never, when it came time for the magazine to be due, because it was a monthly magazine, and at some point even slackers have to get the magazine out the door. So I was told that the last week of every month, these guys would be there all night, and they would go insane, you know, and that it would be like a week of hell, or a week and a half of hell. And so I had been told that. And at some point, I must have relayed to one of the editors before I started there. I think I was nervous. I was like, so before I start there, like, I just got to ask, I've heard all these horror stories about you guys being there, like, all night. Like, I can't really do that. I'm married now. Like, I don't want to get myself in a situation where, like, I'm pulling multiple all-nighters at your office. So please just tell me straight, because maybe though this job sounds great, maybe I shouldn't do it. So I was a little gun-shy. And on the first day, I came in, and they had done all this stuff just to scare the shit out of me. They had put, sleeping bags in the conference rooms. They had made it look like people never left, which they did. Like, no one ever slept over, never. But they did all this just to scare the shit out of me. So they put sleeping bags around. The editor-in-chief's assistant was this young woman, and she came around with this form that they actually made and printed out, in which I was going to be choosing my meals for the week, which included dinner and breakfast. And I had to like check these boxes, like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have cereal in the morning tomorrow. And like, I seriously was freaking out. Like, I was like, oh my God, like, what am I going to tell my wife? And I actually called her on the phone. I called her on the phone and was like, so we're going to have to talk, because like they're making me fill out like a menu for like the week. Like, I guess I'm having dinner here. And like, she was like, well, you can't do that. So all this, like, my heart was in my throat, and I was just like, what am I going to do? Like, this is worse than I even imagined. And they totally got me. And at the end of the day, and they kept doing it. There's more that I don't even remember. There were more things. Like, it was endless. And they saw my face, and I think they were actually going to keep it going, but they were worried that, like, I was going to quit. And so they called me into the conference room, like they were all waiting for me. And the editor-in-chief got up there in front, and he started talking some bullshit. And then he was a great speaker, and he just went off on some grand oratory, welcome Jeff Green, and then he, just within the context of that, he said, and to let you know, we have been bullshitting you all day. And he just said it that way, and I was like, what? And then they all laughed. And the thing was, like, then I was like, I had never been happier in any moment in my professional career to date until then. I was like, I'm at a place where they spent the entire day fucking with my brain. I was so happy. I was like, I am home. Like, thank you for hiring me. And that was it. Best job I ever had, starting from that day.
There you go. I think through that, your webcam seems to be a little bit declining. So if you could adjust it at all, that'd be great. I think one of the other things too that today a lot of people don't realize is that the work that went into these magazines on a monthly basis, because today they're completely different. The magazines don't really exist apart from maybe Game Informer, and I think I can't really think of any other gaming
still exists.
Yeah, okay,
actually,
that's right. Edge.
PC Gamer still exists. Actually.
That's true. There are a couple out there. There's still the big ones for sure. What was the normal routine put into an issue from kind of starting at the beginning of the month and then to the end of the month? What was that routine like?
It was very, very different. Like, it's very hard to get people to remember and understand. Like, there was no internet. It did not exist at the time that I was first working at Computer Gaming World, and so we were the source of gaming information. Like, there was the stuff that we would. It was basically kind of like a 6-week cycle from the time we would start writing to the time, or even 8 weeks, to the time you would buy it on the newsstand. So you would be buying the April issue that we had written in February, because that's just how long everything took.
Right.
So, but of course, because there was no internet, people weren't used to the immediacy of information in that way. So it actually didn't really feel like we were behind the times, because everybody was doing it back then. But basically, to just briefly walk you through it, the way, it was basically a 4-week cycle, because it was every month we had an issue to put out. And we were always in various stages of magazines at any one given time. So at one point we would be putting one issue to bed, or we would be reading page proofs sent back from the printer while we were starting to assign stories for the next one. So we had to keep the flow going at all times. So it's really hard to just. There was never just like one issue that you were working on exclusively. But to walk you through one issue, if I can, you would put one to bed. You definitely would spend those last couple days in a complete, utter, like, panic, frenzy, writing shit at the last minute. You would collapse for like 2 or 3 days and not do anything. People would just play games, come in at 11, play Quake all day. And then after a few days of that, it would be like, oh shit, now we only have 3.5 weeks left. So we better start working. And we would have editorial meetings, Um, when I started at Computer Gaming World, we were divided up by genre. So all the editors were genre editors. I was the adventure game editor, and I was the sports game editor. I was the adventure RPG editor and the sports game editor. There was a action editor. There was a strategy game editor. There was a flight sim editor. So one guy's full-time job was to be the flight sim editor, which shows you just how much the gaming world has changed over the years. Uh, and and we would get together and basically pitch stories to ourselves as a group. It would be a big group meeting, and we would pitch features. Sometimes it would be obvious what the feature was going to be because it was a big game that we had access to. Other times somebody would think something up on their own, and then from there we would assign the stories out either to each other, those of us on the staff, or to a pool of freelance writers we had. And in terms of my own writing, this is really where I had to step it up, and where I made the transition finally from just being an editor of other people's stuff to writing. Because Johnny Wilson, the editor-in-chief, when I took the job, said, "We all write here, Jeff. Like, you have to write if you're going to do this. Like, you can't just edit other people's stuff." But it became natural to me because suddenly I was in a magazine where I loved the content, so writing about it was a natural step, an easy step for me to take.
Sure.
So anyway, so we were all assigning articles to each other, and then about a week or 2 weeks would go by in which we were either researching the articles or we were playing the games that we had to review because we were all reviewing titles every month. And then the articles would just start coming in one by one. They would come in. They didn't come in by regular mail. It wasn't that old. We actually did. There was email back then, so I think we used to get our files electronically. And we would have back and forth with the writers. They would go back for multiple drafts. Then we would start sending the files to the printer. The printer would bring back proofs for us to read, and that would be it. One part of the process that I've totally left out is the cover process, because of course that was crucial.
Mm-hmm.
There were only 12 issues a month, and there were a lot of games released all the time. So it became, and it's still the case today, and it's true with any industry. What goes on the cover is a very important consideration, right? And it would matter both to the magazine and to the people who were getting on the cover. Everybody wants to be on the cover. So we were constantly having game companies coming in and wanting a cover story. And so we had to do a lot of work was spent every month deciding what was going to be on the cover, what that cover image was going to look like. All that stuff was very important and took a lot of brain power. We probably spent more time on the cover than we did a lot of the interior of the magazine combined, because it's the first thing everybody sees. You want it to jump off the newsstand.
Right.
So, it was really just it was just a machine for a long time. And again, it was years before the internet really played a part. Even at the time, if you go back to 1996, 97, 98, you can see us writing about online gaming, LAN gaming, but there was yet no clue at all that medium, the online space, was going to be used to communicate what we were doing, game news and game knowledge. Like at that point, it didn't cross our minds that was going to happen. So we were still the prime source for all of that stuff, and we really felt it. I mean, at that time, we were kind of like the big men on campus. Like the few magazines that existed, there weren't that many game magazines, and there weren't that many positions in the game magazines. So these were really coveted jobs to get. They were hard to get. I got lucky, but it was like when someone would leave a magazine, it was like somebody dying. There would be like 50 people swooping in or more than that to try to get these jobs. And when we would go to things like E3, we were like frickin' kings because we were the ones who would decide what was going to get printed, 8 weeks later. Like our E3 articles would come out months after E3. and it's impossible to imagine now, but that would be the first time people would be reading about what happened at E3. It'd be like 2 months after the event. I mean, now people are, tweeting. Even a live blog is like passe, right? You've got to tweet all the way through these things.
Right. Right.
So it was a very different world. And the one bad thing about being on a monthly schedule, which was the things that I was warned about when I was back at Mac Week, was that because it's monthly, was a lot of time in which it was easy to screw around and not work, especially in the time between assigning the articles and the articles coming in. There was like a nice dead period there where you should have been doing other things. Like you should have been working on the game you were supposed to review, but things were happening at the time in gaming, like LAN gaming was really taking off. And I'll tell you, man, there were days where all we did was play Quake, like for hours, like for so long that we would feel sick and bad about ourselves. Like we would like log off and we'd be going home and we'd be like, oh, that was awful. Like you just didn't feel good. Like,
yeah, I know exactly how you felt. I did the same thing. So
yeah, I mean, it wasn't just like the eye strain, like not just physically feeling bad. You felt like bad morally. You felt just like a bad person. Like, ah, man, it's like I just took Ziff Davis's money for 8 hours. And, my wife, like I'd go home and she'd be like, "How's your day at work?" And I'd be like, "Oh God, it really kind of wasn't work." Like,
Yeah, those were the Quake days. I think for me especially, for a little tangent, like those were like the best days I think of computer gaming. Just like Quake 1 especially, Quake 2 especially, and even Quake 3 Arena, while it was still an inferior game in some regards or some aspects, it was still, you could just suck so much time into those regardless of what you were supposed to be doing.
Yeah, there was something about it. I mean, I don't think it's rose-colored glasses. I think it's just that it was so new, the concept that you could be playing with other people,
Right.
and killing them in these games and humiliate them. Like especially when like at a LAN, like when it was all of us at the magazine playing together, and the tech editor, he set up a LAN room, so we were all in the same room even, and it was just like being in an arcade where all the machines were chained together. I mean, of course that is what it was,
Yeah.
right? And the trash talk was just like
That was the best
epic.
part. You hit a
It was
rail
epic.
shot, and you of course let them know that you hit that rail shot.
Right. It just felt like the greatest thing ever. It was so satisfying. I mean, we would just be in tears all day long from laughing. It was just, it was such a joy. And then, again, I don't want to be rose-colored glasses about it, but my problem later with shooters, even to this day, and there's plenty that I love, I do, but my problem with the multiplayer now is just I miss just those pure free deathmatch days. Like because my twit skills have declined, which means I'm not going to be good no matter what. But like I particularly loathe shooters now that are team-based, which are most of them, only because I'm always getting my own team mad. I feel bad about letting my teammates down. Like when it's a death match and it's just me, I feel okay because I'm only responsible for myself and my own death count. When my deaths are affecting my teammates, that's when I feel crappy.
Sure.
So I have great longing for those days of yore.
Yeah.
Those pure deathmatch days.
Of course. I think for me, it's a little bit lost in the course of events. Was 1UP a part, or sorry, was CGW a part of 1UP before it became GFW? That transition happened later, right?
Right. Yeah. That's a good question, and it's a fairly confused history actually, and I probably can't even tell it accurately. I mean, like at some point, GameSpot was owned by Ziff Davis, and GameSpot was a part of us, and then they went indie. So there's a whole lot of incestuous stuff going on with all of the then nascent online properties. That stuff was brand new, and it wasn't quite clear how they were even going to fit in. When the first thing that happened really was that CGW was the only game magazine that Ziff Davis owned. EGM and OPM and all those came later. That was because Ziff Davis bought whatever company it was that owned them. So the console mags joined us, those of us who were working on the PC mag. And what that did was that then put that pool of people all in the same building for the first time. We were all only print at the time, but now you had Dan Shu, Shane Bettenhausen, myself, all the early Ziff Davis people. We were now, all the gaming editors were now in the same building making game magazines. So that happened on the one hand. And then when the first online initiatives started to come through, I'm just not going to remember, but the game magazines had an online component before 1UP became 1UP. Because I remember when we went through the exercise of the 1UP naming section. But originally 1UP was Ziff Davis's gaming web channel. It wasn't necessarily affiliated with the magazines yet. Like, it wasn't understood at the very beginning that, for example, CGW, the magazine, needed to have a CGW online component. As the exponential growth happened, of course, everything swung way more online. But at first, they were totally siloed as separate things. Like, that was just the online guys doing whatever the hell online means, and we were still making our magazine. But then later, we became more integrated over time. And should I explain the CGW GFW switch? I suppose I probably should.
Well, I think that for the most part, people understand it. It was rebranded is the main thing, right?
Yeah, it was rebranded into Games for Windows, the official magazine.
Right.
And that story is fairly well known. It was mostly just a last-ditch effort to actually save computer gaming world, because the part we're skipping here is that the circulations of the print magazine started a steep decline.
Right. Towards the end of
right.
Around 2000, right? I think is when that started.
Yeah, as the internet kept growing, it just started being doomed for the magazines. And we held out all the way till 2008. But around I don't know when we switched over. It was around 2006. Microsoft basically came in and said, "Have we got a deal for you?" And we did it because it was either that or CGW was going to close, and we didn't want to see it close. So with the launch of Games for Windows and Games for Windows Live, we rebranded our magazine as the official magazine of that.
Before we get
go ahead. Sorry, no.
I was going to say, before we get to kind of the CGW to GFW transition, was there ever like a game review during your period, and maybe this is across both magazines, that you came to regret today, or look back and feel, well, maybe I didn't give it a good enough score, or maybe it didn't deserve that score, or man, that was some terrible writing, or anything like that? Any regrets, good or bad?
I hate to say it, like, I was mostly fairly accurate in retrospect for most of the time. A lot of my writing at that time, would be embarrassing to me. I got better over the years, just like we all do with practice. So my earliest game reviews probably weren't so hot. I might have. I'm going to struggle to come up with a good example, but there probably are cases where I might have overrated a little, where I might have been like so enthusiastic about it at the time, and it wore out its welcome sooner than I expected afterwards. Like, by the time the magazine was in print, because there would be many weeks lag, by the time it was in print, I would be going like, well, shoot, I don't actually think it's that good anymore. But I remember feeling that way, but I don't have a good concrete example. And I got to review a lot of great games. I reviewed Half-Life 1 when it first came out. I reviewed Fallout 1, Interstate 76. I had a lot of great review assignments back in the day. None are popping out as like some horrible stain on my
sure.
On my
well, then maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing, right?
Maybe someone watching or listening will remember something I completely screwed
I'm
up.
sure there's someone out there that is
I'm sure.
extremely upset for a score that you gave. Who
I'm
knows what
sure.
game it is?
I
Who knows
pissed
what
people
game it
off
is?
over the years, that's for sure.
What was the biggest loss in the transition of the magazine from CGW to GFW, in your opinion?
Biggest loss?
Yeah, yeah, something that you couldn't get back no matter what you tried to do.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind there would be the time and the depth we were able to put into individual pieces. You know, the immediacy of online just required a quicker turnaround. Of course, that's a real blanket statement, and it's not true of a lot of things. You can look at places like Polygon right now who do great long form pieces, but but for the most part, we lost the care and the consideration and the time that we could really put into things.
Hmm.
You know, when we made this magazine, it was really like a thing we were making. It was a physical object, and we took great care to make sure that from beginning to end, it felt good. It felt like a good thing to hold and to want to carry and keep and file away. And in those days, the magazines were like hundreds and hundreds of pages. Like they were huge. There was so much to cover. Um, and there was something just about having those tangible objects that I really missed. You know, seeing the magazines in the newsstand never got old. It never got old seeing like your magazine for sale in a store. So that's all the kind of stuff I missed.
Were you ever at one time, kind of throughout the GFW lifetime, handheld or pressured or anything like that from Microsoft in terms of an opinion or anything that went into the magazine? Was there ever any pressure from Microsoft themselves?
No, not from Microsoft or from anybody. Ziff Davis, you know, we were pretty strict about, you know, a lot of that stuff. Like there was, I could tell you what would happen is uh, we would hear about a game company being mad about a review we wrote, and sometimes they would actually pull their ads from the magazine. You know, one thing to understand, and it's true even to the magazines to this day, is that all the advertising, it's called endemic advertising. So all the advertising inside is about the thing you're writing about, right? So the game magazines are full of ads from game companies. So the people who are paying to keep you afloat, basically, you're reviewing their product. So, of course, in their mind, they feel they should get a good review because they're paying all this money to advertise with you. But of course, in reality, that's ludicrous if the magazine wants to have any integrity whatsoever. And the good magazines would erect that wall between sales and editorial and would protect the editors. And so, you know, we would hear about it. We would hear, geez, you know, or sometimes even in advance. I do remember there was a case or two where someone from sales would come around and they would have seen a game review that I had written. It wasn't in print yet, but they would come around and go, "Man, Jeff, really? Like, do you have to? Like, couldn't it just be? Could you just get it up to 3.5 stars instead of 3? They'd be so happy." And like, there was just no fucking way. There was no way that any self-respecting editor would ever do that, you know. And that's what happened to Jeff Gersman, and that's of course what Gersman Gate is all about.
Right.
You know, was that very scenario of him being pressured by management to change his review score. And you know, if you were a self-respecting game writer or editor, and are to this day, you just don't do that because that's all you got. All you have is your reputation. If you blow that, you're worthless, and then you might as well just go into PR because no one's going to believe what you say. So and Microsoft, once they were in charge of once their name was on our magazine, the only requirement that there was at all from them was they required that they contribute this advertorial, this copy that they wrote that got stuck into the back of the magazine about Games for Windows itself, basically propaganda.
Ah, okay. I do
And so
remember this.
that was the deal with the devil that we made. But they didn't care about what we wrote inside, and they never saw what we wrote ahead of time. They wouldn't see it until the magazine went to print or was in the newsstand.
to jump to oneup.com, I think that website, for a lot of people, myself included, it was really the rise of this personality-driven content with things like the One Up Show and all the different podcasts that almost every single person there it seemed to be on one. It was just a huge bed of great personality within the scene. Before I even get to the question that I had lined up, you spoke about a One Up naming session.
Yeah.
What were some of the other names that occurred for that?
Um,
And if you need to take a second, please.
no, I'm just trying to remember. I mean, gosh, they were all over the place. I mean, I don't, if you talk to Sam Kennedy, who was the guy who ran the site for the longest time,
Right.
I bet he probably has some, either email docs or actually even like physical pieces of paper with the original names. I don't remember. They were all over the place. There were some nonsense words, a la like a Google sort of thing where we just made something up. But I do remember when One Up got thrown out as an idea. It was fairly unanimous. Like everybody was like, it had a good ring to it. Everybody knew what it meant. It felt right, like almost from the beginning.
Did you carry over the antics and just the work environment that existed at CGW? Would you say that it was pretty much the same with everyone and everything that was happening at One Up?
Totally. Yeah, totally it did. And, I witnessed CGW itself go through, like, multiple staff changes, because I was there for so long. I was at that magazine for 12 years. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of editors came and went. Basically, I became editor-in-chief out of attrition. When there was no one left, I got the job. And what the consistent thing was, though, was that attitude, like, and the antics and all that. Like, it never changed. So you would get different generations of the exact same kind of person, and definitely between all the magazines too. Every magazine had its own personality, of course. Like the guys at EGM had their own personality. The guys at Official PlayStation Magazine had their personality, and we were somewhat siloed, I would say, before OneUp.com and before we all started getting on the internet with the podcast. We were kind of in our own little bubbles for the longest time, and I didn't even really know who those guys were. Like, I would see guys like Shane every day in the hallway, but I would just be like, who's that tall, like, Nordic, dumb-looking guy? And that's all it was. Or they would be like, oh, so stupid console idiots. That was like the height of the PC versus console wars back in the day. And I'm sure we were like the nerdy, older, like PC gaming dorks. But we've had to start mixing it up and integrating when the magazine started going online and we started doing the podcast. And of course, that ended up being like an incredible bonanza. Like, we actually found out that we all really loved each other, and there were these great personality mixes amongst all the different staffs that then started to play out in things like the One Up Show. And One Up Yours.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I think that the next question is really, the Brodeo is probably one of the most, I guess, revered is a good way to say it in terms of podcast and all of gaming. In your opinion,
Thank you.
What made it work? Like, what clicked?
Yeah.
And was it there from the very beginning, or was it something that you guys learned?
Well, I've told the story before about the origin, which is that we didn't want to do it. I don't want to belabor the story because I know a lot of people have heard it a lot from me, but we got dragged into it. All the magazines were told that they had to podcast because that was the thing. That was what we do now in this online world. And I mean, I think we literally like dragged our asses down there the first day. Like, we had such a bad attitude, like we didn't want to do it. And there was something about that, though, like going down there with a bad attitude, that started us off on the course of what the Brodeo became. Because from the first episode, we didn't go down there with an agenda, and we didn't go down there with like, today we're going to talk about whatever, Wing Commander 5. We were just like, fuck this, let's go downstairs. And then we just turned on the mics. And so from the very start, we never got formal about it. We never had a plan. And so what happened was that the banter that we would have amongst ourselves just in the course of making the magazine, that just became the podcast. And we never had any direction. We never had anyone listening to us or telling us what to do. And so as soon as the podcast started going off the rails, where we weren't talking about gaming at all, and no one was calling us on it at all, we were just like, okay, well, I guess we'll just keep doing this. So I think it was just a natural result of our personality mix. Like, we didn't plan it, and we certainly didn't plan for it to be popular. I mean, we didn't have any clue that it was going to be popular at all, and it surprised us, and it actually kind of weirded us out at the beginning, especially because we didn't want to do it. And so, people would start emailing us about the podcast more than they would about the magazine, and we would be like, read the magazine. We're magazine people. We're just doing this thing because they're making us do it.
How long did that carry over till you guys started to triumph, or I guess champion is the word I'm looking for, with the podcast, or was it always read the magazine over the podcast?
Well, it was never don't read the magazine. We always wanted people to read the magazine.
Right,
I mean,
right.
That was our day job. We went in once a week for a couple hours to do the podcast. The whole rest of the week was making a magazine.
Sure.
So that was really our job.
And the podcast didn't make money because podcasts don't make money. So
right, they don't make money. They don't to this day, right?
Right.
I mean,
right.
The rare few do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, but of course, a lot of what we talked about was kind of the BS around making magazines, and we talked a lot about the magazine business and making fun of the other game magazines and things like that. I think it started to turn around. It was probably an organic thing of realizing that we had fans, that people actually liked what we were doing, and then we were like, when we started showing up on NeoGAF, we were like, no one had ever talked about us on NeoGAF when we were just a magazine. It was like all of a sudden, and people knew our names, and it affects you. You were like, whoa, like, okay, people like what we're doing, like, that's amazing. And when people like what you're doing, then you like doing it, right? So we were like, okay, well, we can do this. And so it became fun because we knew actually people were listening. So in a way, the popularity sort of engendered our own like of the podcast. We were able to like it because other people liked it. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Is there a singular, and this is probably incredibly hard to quantify, but is there a singular moment or favorite maybe episode or anything like that you can think of, or maybe just even a good one? It doesn't have to necessarily be a favorite, because it is kind of a cheap question.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to say. I when I think back to moments, I mean, for a lot of people, I'm the same. A lot of them are like Sean Elliott doing things. I think the one that stands out in my mind is the whole grocery store stories thing that he told about with Ralphie.
Right.
All that stuff was amazing. Anytime he brought out a new bit like Heroes of the Web or Whiskey Nerd, he would just create these characters in the off hours. And the great thing about him was that they were always a surprise to us. All he would say is, like, we'd go down there and we'd have the stupid grin on his face, and we'd just go, okay, guys, like, I'm going to start the show. Just go with it. Just let me do it. And we had no idea what he would do, and then he would bust into something ridiculous, and then that would end up being, a regular feature like Heroes of the Web. But I can't really recall, a particular standout episode. No.
Sure.
It's mostly just like random memories of Sean Elliott are the things I remember the most.
Of course. There's been several reunions at things like PAX. You guys have done a couple of one-off episodes every now and then.
Yeah.
Is there ever a full return in sight? Is that something that you guys could ever do?
Yeah, we get asked that a lot, and
Yeah.
Like, we all still really love each other a lot. Like, we're still tight as a group. We don't talk that often, but when we do, it's almost like, the magazine never closed. And I think if you polled each one of us individually, or as a group, I think we would say we would do it again in a heartbeat. I think all of us look back, and it's like no offense to like other jobs I've had since that have been great, but I think a lot of us, and I think this is true for a lot of the one-up people, not just CGW. I think if you ask a lot of those other folks who people are familiar with, they will mark that time as like the best time of their career. It was really just like all the stars that aligned. Like there was so much good energy in the building at that time. Like all those podcasts were firing on all cylinders at that time, and we were really just happy to do it. So I think we would like to, we would like to. People ask us all the time, like, well, what if you did a Kickstarter? Like, how about a Kickstarter for CGW for the Brodeo? But the problem isn't the money. The problem is really just the logistics now. It's like we're all like literally in different cities, which is less of a problem than it used to be, right? I mean, you and I are talking from different states,
Right.
but and different time zones. But it is a different feel than when you're in the same room.
100%. Completely different environment. Yeah.
Completely different. And so there's that, and then there's also the flat out reality that we all have different jobs, and in some cases those jobs prevent us from being as free as we were on the radio, because obviously on the radio we could say whatever we want, and we did. But right now there's topics that just have to be off limit because people would get in trouble. And so we don't want to do like a half-assed one, like we wouldn't want to bring it back and have it be kind of a shadow of itself because we couldn't talk the way we used to talk. Like in some cases, it's just better to have those awesome memories, and we will continue to do reunion shows as long as people will still go to them. I mean, there's going to be a diminishing returns. It's not to be false modest or whatever. I do think that at some point, as the years go by here, people just aren't even going to remember, or kids growing up aren't going to even know what the hell it is. We already see it happening now to some extent, and that's fine. It's the way it goes. So anyway, we'll do them as long as people are interested, because we still like each other. I don't think we would see a full-on weekly Brodeo again.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the fall of One Up, and I think that towards the end, we saw a lot of the big names, kind of Luke, John Davis. People just kind of started to file out the door. Was that a result of them being picked off and knowing of the news ahead, or was it just them being picked off? I think a lot of people have always wondered that. If people knew ahead of time.
I think it's probably a different answer for everybody, honestly. And I'm not dodging the question. I think some people probably were picked off and they just wanted to go, like it was their dream job, like probably Luke at Bungie, though I don't know that for sure. But, but in other cases, people did know. And, certainly the atmosphere in the building, like you could feel it. I mean, and we knew we would get we would have meetings where they would tell us all how fucked we were. It wasn't like a big mystery. Like it only added in a way to the way we all bonded, and we all that's why we were all going through this thing. Like they were tightening the screws all the time. At some point, they sent us an email that they took away the fucking plastic silverware. Like we had to bring our own spoons from home if we wanted to eat cereal at the office. Like everything was getting cut one by one. So like the writing was on the wall. Like you needed to worry about your job. And like those of us who were a little bit older, who had families like me, like it was a real concern. So like when I left, that's why. It was because I knew my magazine was going to get shut down. I knew I was going to be out of a job, and I just wanted to jump the gun and be prepared for that. It sucked every time one of those guys left. Every time one of them left, there'd be a whole round of like, oh no, now they're leaving, and it would further demoralize the whole gang when another beloved one-up person would leave. I mean, however sad it made people feel who were listening and watching, and I understand that, like those were the people we worked with every day, and it sucked to lose them on what felt like a daily or weekly basis near the end there.
The day that I guess the news kind of came down the wire that the GFW was closing, the day that you guys ended up getting the news, what What was that like? Like, can you walk us through the day? Did you go to work expecting a normal day, and then they called you into an office and was like, "Jeff, we need to talk," or what was that
Yeah,
conversation like?
it was pretty much like that, and I knew before the rest of the staff.
Hmm.
So I got called into John Davison's office. He was the editorial director at the time, and the other editors in chief were there. I think not all of them were there, but I was told that it was shutting down, and I guess it was GFW at that time, not CGW.
Hmm.
And it was really like a huge kick in the stomach. It was really hard. I mean, that magazine had been around since like 1980. It was a very old magazine. It was extremely prestigious in its day, and I'm not talking about my time there. In the old days, in the Johnny Wilson days, they were the like magazine of record, and I felt bad that that ended on my watch. I mean, it wasn't my fault, of course. It was going to end on whoever was at the helm. Um, but it really felt like a really huge loss, like that. Again, even during the days when the Brodio was hot, that still was our day-to-day life. And it just felt like really like the end of an era. And of course, then I had to carry it around as the editor in chief for a few days until I was able to tell the staff, and that really sucked because like I knew we weren't even going to finish the issue that they were all working on, and I wasn't allowed to say. So people were like scrambling and working on their articles, and I was like, yeah, you may not want to work so hard on that. Please don't stay late working on that.
Was there a podcast recorded during those couple of days that you knew and no one else did? Can you recall?
Wow, that's a great question. I would have to go back through the archive and look. That's a great, great question. I do remember that we recorded after we all knew.
Right.
If we recorded at a time when I knew and they didn't, I would have been by necessity. I would have been poker faced throughout the thing.
Yeah.
Um, but it was whether we did or not. Those were a terrible few days, and I hated it.
Of course.
I hated knowing, and they didn't know.
Was there anything that could have happened to kind of keep the Ziff Davis boat afloat at any point in time, or was it just doomed?
They were doomed from years of mismanagement, years of overspending, years of fiscal incompetence. As long also misjudging trends, not jumping on things fast enough, taking the competition for granted. That happened a lot. Other magazines coming up and eating our lunch at a time when Ziff Davis thought that they were unbeatable. There were so many things that went wrong at the top levels, and it was extremely frustrating to have no control or power over that whatsoever. Those of us at the magazine, even as an editor-in-chief, I was still a low man on the totem pole in the Ziff Davis organization. And you had all these people, most of them who didn't even work in the building, they were in New York City, making these kind of decisions that directly affected us. Really, by the time of 2008, when things were shutting down, that ship had sailed. There was no chance.
Hmm. What was the one thing that you miss most about your time there, looking back and perhaps reminiscing, or multiple things like?
Well, the first thing that pops to mind is definitely the camaraderie of that group. I mean, it was really an outstanding group of people, and I think even at the time we knew that, like, okay, this is something like kind of special. Like, the list of names is endless of people who were there. It was really quite an amalgam of great, funny people that were just fun to be around. I mean, every day when I went to work, and I was at so it was from 1996 until 2008 that I was at a combination of CGW plus Ziff Davis. So was it 12 years? So during those 12 years, there wasn't one day where I went, shit, I have to go to work. Not once. I always wanted to go to work, and I would be on BART going like, and I would acknowledge like, I am so lucky. Like I love my job, and I'm so lucky to love my job. You know, most people don't get that in their career. So I definitely miss all that camaraderie. I miss being in the press. I miss uh, having that voice and having that kind of autonomy to say what I want. I haven't been able to do that in the jobs I've had since. I miss making the print magazine, and of course, I miss the Brodeo guys tremendously.
Well, I think we're going to take a quick break. When we'll come back. We'll be talking about EA, PopCap, of course, and then just jump into a general Q&A, guys. So thanks, everyone, for
Excellent.
watching here. Real Talk with Jeff Green, and we'll see you guys in part 3 right after this.